When the tank columns of the 1st Guards Army entered Berlin in the spring of '45, they were led by a man whose name became synonymous with tank mastery, Mikhail Katukov, a commander whose military genius changed the understanding of tank warfare and turned the pages of World War II history. In the pantheon of great commanders of this war, he occupies a special place, the creator of unique tactics that saved thousands of lives and brought victory closer. From a humble peasant son to an army commander, his path was filled with trials, insights, and decisions that changed the course of battles. Katukov created what would later be called Katukov's tactics, a system of tank ambushes and maneuverable battles that allowed him to resist German tank wedges even in the most difficult months of the war. His name thundered near Moscow, where his brigade was the first to receive the Guards title. It instilled terror in German tank crews on the Kursk Bulge. It became a symbol of a swift offensive in Poland and Germany. This man managed to transform Soviet tank forces from disparate formations into a formidable force that even Berlin could not withstand. In 1896, in the small village of Bolshoy Uvarovo, Ryazan Governorate, the future tank genius Mikhail Katukov was born into a simple peasant family. His childhood passed in toil and hardship, as did that of many peasant children of that time. Village school provided him with elementary education, but life itself became Mikhail's true university. Katukov's fate took a sharp turn in 1919, when the 23-year-old was conscripted into the Red Army. The Civil War became the future commander's first combat experience. He fought on the Southern Front against Denikin's troops, proving himself a disciplined and courageous fighter. Mikhail received his first command experience unexpectedly. When the platoon commander was killed in one of the battles, Katukov took command and successfully completed the assigned task. This episode did not go unnoticed by the command, and soon Mikhail was sent to courses for Red commanders. The 1920s were a time of diligent study and mastery of military science for Katukov. He eagerly absorbed knowledge, studying military history, tactics, and strategy. He was particularly interested in works on maneuver warfare and the use of technology on the battlefield. In the 1930s, Katukov linked his destiny with tank forces. This was a time when the tank was only establishing itself as the main striking force of ground troops. Mikhail Efimovich was among those commanders who were destined to create a new branch of service practically from scratch. Participation in the battles of Khalkhin Gol in 1939 became a especially valuable experience for Katukov. It was there, in the sands of Mongolia, that he first saw how tanks could decide the outcome of a battle when used correctly. Observing the actions of Georgy Zhukov, Katukov drew important conclusions for himself about the concentration of armored vehicles in decisive directions. By the early 1940s, Mikhail Katukov was already commanding a tank regiment. He closely followed events in Europe, where German tank wedges sliced through the defenses of one country after another. Analyzing blitzkrieg tactics, Katukov began to form his own vision of tank warfare, which would soon be tested in the harshest trials. On the eve of the Great Patriotic War, Katukov was given command of the 20th Tank Division. Hundreds of combat vehicles and thousands of tank crewmen were under his command. Few at that time could have predicted that this modest, taciturn commander was destined to become one of the creators of victory and change the perception of tank warfare. On June 22, 1941, war descended upon the Soviet Union. For Mikhail Katukov, as for millions of Soviet people, the most difficult ordeal of his life began. In the first days of the war, Colonel Katukov was appointed commander of the 4th Tank Brigade, formed from the remnants of the 20th Tank Division. September and October of 1941 became a turning point in Katukov's military biography. The German Army Group Center began Operation Typhoon, a general offensive on Moscow. At the vanguard of this deadly typhoon was Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, considered the best tank commander of the Wehrmacht. Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade was tasked with meeting this blow in the Orel and Mtsensk area. The forces were unequal. Against 1,500 Soviet tanks, more than 300 German vehicles advanced, supported by aviation and motorized infantry. It seemed the outcome of this confrontation was predetermined. But Katukov made a decision that subsequently changed the perception of tank tactics. Instead of throwing his vehicles into a frontal assault, as had been done before, he positioned his tanks in ambushes along the probable routes of enemy advance. T-34 tanks were camouflaged in forests, ravines, and behind hills. On October 6th, Guderian's forward units, not expecting serious resistance, moved along the highway to Tula. German tanks were advancing in marching columns when Katukov's camouflaged T-34s suddenly struck from the flanks. The very first battle brought a stunning result. More than 40 German tanks were destroyed with minimal Soviet losses. Guderian was shocked. In his memoirs, he would later write, "For the first time since the beginning of the Russian campaign, we encountered skillfully organized enemy defenses." The German general personally arrived at the battlefield to understand the reasons for the failure, and Katukov continued to refine his tactics. In the following days, his brigade struck at German columns, appearing unexpectedly and disappearing just as suddenly. Katukov's tankers operated in small groups of 5 to 7 vehicles, coordinating their actions and supporting each other with fire. Especially effective was the rolling fire tactic, where one group of tanks fired from a stationary position while another maneuvered to a new position. This created the impression for the enemy that they were dealing with much larger forces. The battles near Mtsensk continued for about 2 weeks. During this time, Katukov's brigade destroyed more than 130 German tanks, dozens of artillery pieces, and hundreds of enemy soldiers. The pace of Guderian's offensive in this sector was significantly slowed, which provided precious time to strengthen Moscow's defenses. Katukov's new tactics did not go unnoticed by the High Command. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command studied the experience of the battles near Mtsensk and recommended its dissemination to all tank units. On November 11, 1941, the 4th Tank Brigade, for its displayed courage, was reorganized into the 1st Guards Tank Brigade, the 1st Guards Tank Formation in the Red Army. Katukov himself learned important lessons from these battles. He understood that in conditions of enemy air superiority, and often numerical superiority in equipment, it was necessary to maximize the use of surprise, terrain, and maneuver. The tank, in his understanding, transformed from a means of frontal assault into an instrument of complex tactical combat. Thus, in the fire of the first months of the war, the famous Katukov's tactics were born, which subsequently became the basis of Soviet tank warfare. And Mikhail Efimovich himself transformed from a little-known commander into a recognized master of tank combat, whose name was spoken with respect even by his adversaries. In the autumn of 1941, Mikhail Katukov carried out a true revolution in tank tactics. In a situation where German tank wedges seemed invincible, he created a system of countermeasures that would later become the foundation of the Soviet tank school. Katukov's main innovation was the rejection of straightforward frontal attacks in favor of flexible, maneuverable defense and counterattacks from ambushes. What were the main principles of Katukov's tactics? First and foremost, it was deeply echeloned tank ambushes. Katukov was the first to realize that the T-34, with its powerful gun and reliable armor, was ideally suited for ambush operations. He positioned tanks stealthily, using terrain folds, forest edges, and natural shelters, choosing positions that ensured surprise in the attack and the ability to quickly withdraw. The second key element was the fist strike principle. Katukov abandoned the uniform distribution of tanks along the front, concentrating them on the directions of the enemy's main thrusts. This allowed for the creation of local superiority, even with the Germans' overall numerical advantage. No less important was the art of maneuver. Katukov's tanks never stayed in one place for long periods. After striking, they quickly changed positions, avoiding return fire and airstrikes. This mobility gave the enemy the impression that they were fighting against much larger forces. Katukov also developed a system of echeloning tank groups. The first echelon conducted reconnaissance in force and tied down the enemy. The second delivered the main blow, and the third was used to develop success or cover a retreat. This formation ensured flexibility and stability in battle. Mikhail Efimovich paid special attention to interaction with other branches of service. His tanks never operated in isolation. They worked closely with artillery, which suppressed enemy anti-tank weapons, infantry, which covered tanks from enemy anti-tank groups, and sappers, who provided passages through minefields and engineering barriers. Katukov was also a master of night operations. When German aviation dominated the air, he often carried out regroupings and even attacks under the cover of darkness, which was completely uncharacteristic for tank forces of that time. A crucial element of the Katukov school was the special attention paid to reconnaissance. Tanks were never committed to battle blindly. Katukov demanded a detailed study of the terrain, the location of enemy anti-tank weapons, and the composition of their grouping. For this, reconnaissance groups, aerial reconnaissance, and prisoner interrogations were actively used. All these innovations were summarized in the famous order on the combat use of tanks, which was issued on Katukov's initiative in November 1941 and became a true Bible for Soviet tank crews. Interestingly, Katukov's tactics largely contradicted pre-war notions about the use of tanks. Before the war, the Red Army was dominated by the theory of deep operations, which involved the massive use of tank formations for a rapid breakthrough of enemy defenses. Katukov, however, based on the real conditions of the war, created a flexible system that combined defensive and offensive elements. The new tactics quickly proved their effectiveness. Already in the battles near Moscow, Katukov's tank crews inflicted significant blows on the Germans with minimal losses of their own. The advantages of the Katukov school were particularly evident at the Battle of Kursk, where his tank army successfully countered elite SS tank divisions, which were armed with the newest Tigers and Panthers. October of '41. Guderian's tank divisions, having broken through the Soviet defenses, rapidly advanced towards Moscow. It seemed that nothing could stop the steel avalanche of the Wehrmacht. In these critical days, the Supreme High Command sent the 4th Tank Brigade, commanded by Colonel Mikhail Katukov, to defend the capital. The brigade took up defensive positions on the Volokholamsk direction, one of the key sectors of the Battle of Moscow. Katukov understood. In a head-on collision with superior German forces, his tank crews were doomed. Something unconventional, unexpected for the enemy was needed. In early November of '41, German tanks launched an offensive against Katukov's brigade's positions. But instead of the usual sight for them, chaotically retreating Soviet troops, they encountered a well-organized system of tank ambushes. Katukov's T-34s, skillfully camouflaged in groves and behind hills, allowed the German vehicles to approach at close range and then shot them at point blank. In one of the battles near the village of Skirmanovo, Katukov's tank crews destroyed 19 German tanks without losing a single one of their own vehicles. This success had enormous moral significance. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Soviet tank crews not only held back the onslaught, but also inflicted serious losses on the enemy. Katukov's skill as a tactician was particularly evident in the battles near Istra. Here, his brigade operated in close cooperation with infantry and artillery, creating a layered defense. German tanks that broke through the first line of defense were met with flank attacks from Katukov's tanks and destroyed. In early December of '41, when the German offensive on Moscow ran out of steam, Katukov's brigade was one of the first to launch a counteroffensive. Operating at the vanguard of Rokossovsky's 16th Army, the tank crews, with swift strikes, broke through enemy defenses and created conditions for the infantry's advance. During 2 weeks of the December counteroffensive, Katukov's brigade fought its way over 100 kilometers, liberating dozens of settlements. In these battles, Katukov's signature style finally took shape, a combination of powerful fire with maneuver, unexpected flank attacks, and close cooperation with other branches of service. For the courage and military skill demonstrated, the 4th Tank Brigade received the Guards title on November 11, 41, becoming the 1st Guards Tank Brigade of the Red Army. This was the highest recognition of Katukov's and his tank crew's merits. Stalin, having received a report on the brigade's actions, personally summoned Katukov to the Kremlin. During the meeting, the Supreme High Commander inquired about the details of the tank battles and the commander's tactical innovations. As a result of this conversation, a special order was issued, instructing all tank units to study and apply the experience of Katukov's brigade. The Battle of Moscow became Mikhail Katukov's finest hour. It was here, in the snows of the Moscow region, that a new Soviet tank school was born, based on flexible tactics, skillful use of terrain, and sudden strikes. The principles laid down by Katukov in these battles subsequently formed the basis of the actions of all Soviet tank formations. At the beginning of 1942, Mikhail Katukov's military career took a significant leap. After the successful actions of his tank brigade near Moscow, the High Command decided to entrust him with a larger formation. On January 7, 1942, Katukov was appointed commander of the 1st Tank Corps, a formation that, in terms of its power and numbers, significantly surpassed a brigade. The transition from commanding a brigade to leading a corps was a serious challenge for Mikhail Efimovich. If previously he had about 50 tanks and several hundred personnel under his command, he was now responsible for 3 tank brigades, a motorized rifle brigade, an artillery regiment, and numerous auxiliary units. A total of more than 200 tanks and 1,000 soldiers and officers. The scale of tasks changed radically. Katukov now had to think in terms of army operations, coordinate the actions of several brigades simultaneously, and interact with front command and neighboring formations. Managing such a complex mechanism as a tank corps required new skills and approaches. The first serious test for Katukov as a corps commander came with the battles on the Bryansk front in the summer of 1942. In the context of the general retreat of Soviet troops in the southern direction, Katukov's corps was tasked with containing the enemy's advance and ensuring the withdrawal of the main forces. It was here that Katukov's unique leadership style manifested itself. Unlike many commanders of that time, he did not seek to control every action of his subordinates. Instead, Mikhail Efimovich clearly defined tasks for the brigades, leaving their commanders freedom in choosing methods of execution. At the same time, he demanded strict adherence to 2 principles: close interaction between units and economical use of tanks. Katukov understood that a tank is not just a combat vehicle. It is a complex organism requiring constant technical maintenance, fuel, and ammunition supply. Therefore, he paid special attention to logistical support. An efficient system for repairing and evacuating damaged vehicles was created in his corps, which allowed damaged tanks to be quickly returned to service. Another feature of Katukov's command style was his personal presence at critical sections of the battle. Despite his high post, he often went to the front line to assess the situation with his own eyes. This allowed him to make decisions based on the real picture of the battle, not just on reports from subordinates. In the autumn of 1942, the 1st Tank Corps under Katukov's command took part in the counterattack near Kozelsk. Here, Mikhail Efimovich's tactical skill as a commander of a large formation fully manifested itself. He skillfully organized the interaction of tank brigades with artillery and aviation, which inflicted a serious defeat on the enemy. In these battles, Katukov's signature style as a commander finally took shape. Thorough reconnaissance before the attack, concentration of forces in the direction of the main thrust, echelonning of tank brigades in depth to develop success, and the creation of mobile anti-tank reserves in dangerous directions. Katukov paid special attention to the selection of command personnel. He personally met with each brigade and regimental commander, evaluating not only their professional skills, but also their personal qualities. Mikhail Efimovich valued proactive, thoughtful officers, capable of making independent decisions in complex situations. By the end of 1942, the 1st Tank Corps under Katukov's command had transformed into a well-coordinated combat organism capable of solving the most complex tasks. The experience gained by Mikhail Efimovich as Corps commander became the foundation for his further growth as a military leader and paved the way for the future creation of the 1st Guards Tank Army, a formation that was destined to follow a glorious combat path from Kursk to Berlin. The summer of 1943 became the time of the greatest tank confrontation in the history of warfare. On July 5th, the German command launched Operation Citadel, an offensive on the Kursk salient, where powerful forces of the Red Army were concentrated. At the spearhead of the main thrust of Army Group South were elite SS Panzer divisions, armed with the latest Tigers and Panthers. Their goal was to break through Soviet defenses in the Oboyan direction and open the way to Kursk. It was here, in the path of the German tank armada, that Mikhail Katukov's 1st Tank Corps stood, recently reorganized into the 1st Tank Army. By this moment, Katukov was already a recognized master of tank warfare, and Stavka had good reason to entrust him with one of the most dangerous sectors of defense. Preparations for the battle began long before the German offensive. Katukov personally toured the positions, checking the readiness of units and formations. He paid particular attention to creating a deeply echeloned anti-tank defense. By his order, a system of strong points saturated with anti-tank artillery was established. Between them were mobile tank ambushes, groups of 3 to 5 vehicles, ready to strike the flank of breakthrough German tanks. On the eve of the offensive, Katukov gathered his brigade and regimental commanders. "The enemy will throw everything they have against us. We will have to meet the assault of new German tanks, but remember, there is no invincible weapon. Tigers and Panthers have weak spots, their sides and rear. You must hit them from the flanks, and only at point-blank range." In the early morning of July 5, 1943, after a powerful artillery barrage and airstrikes, German tank columns moved towards the positions of the 1st Tank Army. Heavy Tigers led the way, followed by medium tanks and infantry on armored personnel carriers. Katukov ordered the first German vehicles to pass through the battle formations of the forward units without opening fire. When the lead Tigers had penetrated deep into the defense, masked anti-tank guns and ambush tanks struck them. Simultaneously, artillery opened fire on the 2nd echelon of German troops, cutting off the infantry from the tanks. On the very first day of fighting, the Germans lost dozens of vehicles, but continued to attack with the tenacity of the doomed. Katukov constantly maneuvered reserves, transferring tank battalions and artillery to threatened directions. His command post was located on a height, from which the battlefield was clearly visible, allowing for prompt reactions to changes in the situation. On the 3rd day of fighting, the German command committed the SS Panzer Corps to battle, which included the Totenkopf, Das Reich, and Adolf Hitler divisions. These were elite units, staffed by experienced crews and the latest equipment. Against them, Katukov deployed fresh tank brigades and anti-tank destroyer regiments. Particularly fierce battles unfolded in the Prokhorovka area, where the largest tank battle of the war took place. Here, Katukov's tankers acted in close cooperation with Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. Hundreds of tanks from both sides clashed in a deadly struggle in a confined space. Katukov skillfully utilized the terrain features. His tanks took up positions on the reverse slopes of heights, advancing to fire only during an attack. This allowed for minimizing losses from the fire of German tanks, which had more powerful guns. By July 12th, it became clear that the German offensive was running out of steam. Having lost hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers, the enemy could not break through the Soviet defenses. On July 15th, Katukov received orders to launch a counteroffensive. His tank army, having worn down the enemy in defensive battles, now delivered crushing blows to retreating German units. The Battle of Kursk became a triumph of Katukov's school of tank warfare. His methods of anti-tank defense, based on deep echelonning of forces, maneuver of reserves, and tank ambushes, proved their effectiveness against the Wehrmacht's best tank formations. Katukov himself was awarded the Order of Suvorov First Class and received the rank of Lieutenant General of Tank Troops. January 1943 became a turning point in Mikhail Katukov's military career. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command, having assessed his outstanding successes in commanding a tank corps, decided to form a new large tank unit. On January 30th, the first tank army was created, which soon received the Honorary Guards title, becoming the first Guards tank army under Katukov's command. The formation of such a large formation was a complex task. The army included 2 tank corps, the 11th and 8th Guards, a mechanized corps, several artillery brigades, anti-aircraft units, and numerous auxiliary units. The total personnel exceeded 35,000 people, with over 500 tanks and self-propelled guns in service. Mikhail Efimovich personally supervised the creation of the Army's command structure. He understood that commanding such a complex organism required a special system. Katukov divided the Army headquarters into an operational department, an intelligence department, a communications department, and rear services. Each unit received clear tasks and authorities. Katukov paid special attention to creating an effective communication system. He perfectly understood that in tank warfare, success depends on the speed of information and order transmission. At his request, each corps and brigade was equipped with modern radio stations, and tank crews underwent special training in conducting radio exchanges in combat conditions. No less important was the issue of the Army's material and technical support. Katukov created mobile repair bases capable of quickly restoring damaged equipment directly in the field. Mobile fuel and ammunition depots were organized, which could follow the advancing tank units. The selection of command personnel became one of Mikhail Efimovich's main concerns. He personally interviewed each corps and brigade commander, carefully studying their combat experience and personal qualities. Katukov valued initiative, the ability to make quick decisions, and take responsibility in officers. At the same time, he did not tolerate overconfidence and reckless bravery that could lead to unjustified losses. A special system for training commanders was developed in the 1st Guards Tank Army. Command and staff exercises were regularly conducted, during which various combat scenarios were practiced. Katukov often organized debriefings of past battles, analyzing successes and mistakes. This approach allowed commanders to learn from real experience and constantly improve their skills. An important element of Katukov's command system was the organization of intelligence. A special intelligence department was created at the Army headquarters, which collected and analyzed information about the enemy. Before each operation, thorough reconnaissance of the terrain and enemy defenses was conducted. Katukov never threw his tanks into battle blindly. Another feature of the 1st Guards Tank Army was the close integration of various branches of service. Tank and mechanized brigades operated in close cooperation with artillery, engineering units, and aviation. Katukov understood that modern combat requires a comprehensive approach, and no single branch of service can succeed alone. By the spring of 1943, the 1st Guards Tank Army had turned into a powerful, well-organized formation, ready to solve the most complex combat tasks. Ahead of it were severe trials at the Battle of Kursk, a swift offensive in Belarus and Poland, and finally, the storming of Berlin. But the foundation of future victories was laid precisely during this period of army formation, when Mikhail Katukov created not just a military formation, but a new school of tank art. Summer of 1944. The Soviet command was preparing an operation that would go down in military textbooks as an example of strategic planning and mastery. Codename Bagration. The goal, the complete liberation of Belarus and reaching the borders of Poland. Mikhail Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army was assigned one of the key roles in this grandiose operation. By this time, Katukov had already become a recognized master of tank warfare. His army, tempered in battles on the Kursk Bulge, represented a powerful strike force capable of solving the most complex tasks. The army comprised over 500 tanks and self-propelled guns, mainly T-34s and the newest IS-2s. Preparations for the operation were carried out in the strictest secrecy. Katukov personally checked the readiness of each unit, met with corps and brigade commanders, and analyzed intelligence data on the enemy. Special attention was paid to cooperation with aviation and artillery. Mikhail Efimovich well understood that the success of modern combat depends on the coordinated actions of all branches of service. Operation Bagration began on June 23, 1944, with a powerful artillery barrage. Hundreds of guns unleashed tons of metal on German positions. Following the fire curtain, the infantry advanced, breaking through the enemy's first line of defense. Katukov kept his tank corps ready, awaiting the moment to commit them to the breakthrough. He understood. The main task of a tank army is not to break through the enemy's fortified defenses, but to rapidly develop the success achieved by the infantry and artillery. This approach allowed for saving personnel and equipment while achieving maximum effect. On June 25th, when a breach formed in the German defenses, Katukov received the long-awaited order to commit the army to the breakthrough. Tank columns surged forward, bypassing pockets of resistance and rushing deep into the enemy's defenses. A swift tank raid began, which went down in history as an example of maneuver warfare. Unlike many other commanders, Katukov did not seek to directly attack the enemy's fortified points. His tanks bypassed centers of resistance, cut communications, and created chaos in the rear of the German troops. Advanced detachments captured bridges and crossings, preventing the enemy from organizing defenses on water lines. A distinctive feature of the actions of the 1st Guards Tank Army in Operation Bagration was the skillful use of advanced detachments. Katukov allocated reinforced tank brigades from the corps, which operated at a significant distance from the main forces. These detachments captured key objectives in the enemy's rear, disrupting the command and supply of German troops. During the offensive, Katukov's tank crews closely cooperated with partisan detachments. Partisans reported valuable intelligence on the enemy, indicated passages through forests and swamps, and assisted in capturing crossings. This cooperation significantly increased the effectiveness of the tank army's actions. The rapid advance of Katukov's tank corps created conditions for the encirclement of large enemy groupings. Thus, in cooperation with other armies, it was possible to encircle and destroy the Minsk grouping of Germans, numbering over 100,000 men. This was one of the largest encirclement operations of the entire war. In 2 weeks of the offensive, the 1st Guards Tank Army advanced over 500 kilometers, liberating hundreds of settlements. The pace of the offensive reached 50 to 60 kilometers per day, an unprecedented figure for that time. The German command was demoralized by the swiftness of the Soviet breakthrough and failed to organize effective defenses. The success of Operation Bagration demonstrated the maturity of Soviet military art and Mikhail Katukov's personal skill as a tank commander. His ability to organize the interaction of various branches of service, maneuver large tank formations, and maintain high rates of advance received high praise from the Stavka of the Supreme High Command. For the brilliant conduct of the Belarusian operation, Katukov was awarded the Order of Kutuzov, first degree. But his main reward was the recognition of his methods of tank warfare and their widespread adoption in the Red Army. The experience of Operation Bagration formed the basis of subsequent offensive operations of Soviet troops and hastened the final victory over Nazi Germany. On January 12, 1945, one of the swiftest and largest operations of the Great Patriotic War began, the Vistula-Oder Offensive. Mikhail Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army was at the spearhead of the First Belarusian Front's main thrust. The tankers faced an ambitious task to break through enemy defenses, develop an offensive in depth, and reach the borders of Germany in the shortest possible time. On the eve of the operation, Katukov gathered his corps and brigade commanders for a final briefing. Pointing to the map of Poland with a pointer, he clearly outlined the plan. Our task is to act preemptively. The Germans expect that after the breakthrough, we will methodically advance, overcoming one line after another. We, however, must stun them with speed, not allow them to recover, not allow them to organize defenses on intermediate lines. Unlike previous operations, Katukov decided to change the structure of the combat formations. Instead of the traditional echeloning of forces in depth, he created powerful advanced detachments, one from each corps. Each detachment included the best tank brigades, reinforced with self-propelled artillery, motorized infantry, and sappers. These detachments were to operate independently of the main forces, rapidly advancing and seizing key objectives in the enemy's rear. Another innovation was the organization of tank-borne assaults. 5 to 6 submachine gunners were placed on the armor of each tank in the advanced detachments. These soldiers provided cover for the vehicles against enemy Panzerfausts in populated areas and helped quickly seize important objectives. The offensive began after a powerful artillery barrage. The 1st Guards Tank Army was committed to battle 24 hours after the start of the operation, when the infantry had breached the enemy's first line of defense. Katukov's tanks rushed into the gap, rapidly expanding the breakthrough and advancing deep into the German defenses. The advanced detachments acted so swiftly that the German command lost control of the situation. Katukov's tankers seized bridges over rivers before the enemy could blow them up, cut communications, and created panic in the rear. Often, tank columns overtook retreating German units, suddenly attacking them from the rear and flanks. Katukov's tactical mastery was particularly evident during the crossing of the Pilitsa River. The Germans expected this water barrier to delay the Soviet offensive for several days. However, the advanced detachment of the 11th Guards Tank Corps, with a sudden strike, captured the bridge near the town of Novo Miasto, preventing the enemy from destroying it. This allowed the army's main forces to cross the river on the move, without lengthy preparations. Katukov personally controlled the pace of the offensive, constantly maintaining radio contact with his corps commanders. When the pace slowed, he immediately ascertained the reasons and took measures to eliminate them. Special attention was paid to supplying the advanced units with fuel and ammunition. By Katukov's order, special columns of fuel trucks were created, which followed directly behind the tank brigades, providing them with everything necessary. By January 17, Katukov's tankers had reached operational space. The pace of the offensive reached 70 kilometers per day, an unprecedented speed for that time. The German command frantically tried to gather reserves to organize a defense, but Katukov's tank columns appeared where they were not expected, sweeping away scattered enemy units. On January 23, the 1st Guards Tank Army liberated Bydgoszcz, an important industrial center and transportation hub. The Germans planned to turn the city into a fortress and delay the Soviet offensive. But Katukov applied his favorite tactic, encirclement. While one part of the forces engaged the enemy from the front, the army's main forces bypassed the city from the north and south, creating a threat of encirclement. The German garrison was forced to hastily retreat, abandoning equipment and weapons. It is noteworthy that during the Vistula-Oder operation, Katukov paid special attention to preserving Polish industry and infrastructure. By his order, the tankers tried to minimize destruction in cities and at enterprises. This had not only economic, but also political significance, contributing to the strengthening of friendly relations with the Polish population. By the end of January, the advanced units of the 1st Guards Tank Army reached the Oder River, the last major water barrier before Berlin. In 3 weeks of the offensive, Katukov's army fought its way over 500 kilometers, liberated hundreds of populated areas, and inflicted enormous damage on the enemy in manpower and equipment. The Vistula-Oder operation became a triumph of Katukov's school of tank warfare. Mikhail Yefimovich proved that a tank army could not just support infantry, but act as an independent strike force, solving strategic tasks. His methods of maneuver warfare, based on high tempos, bold maneuver, and preemption of the enemy, entered the textbooks of military art. April 16, 1945. Dawn was just breaking over the Zilo Heights when hundreds of searchlights suddenly flared, blinding the German defenses. Under their light, tanks of Mikhail Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army moved forward, beginning the last strategic operation of the war, the assault on Berlin. The Zilo Heights represented a formidable natural defensive line on the approaches to the German capital. The Germans had transformed these hills into a true fortress, with a multi-layered system of trenches, pillboxes, and anti-tank obstacles. Here, the enemy concentrated their best remaining units, including SS divisions and Volkssturm. Katukov carefully prepared for this decisive battle. He personally flew over the German front line in a reconnaissance plane, studying the terrain and the location of firing points. Based on the data obtained, a detailed breakthrough plan was developed, taking into account every ravine and height. A distinctive feature of Katukov's tactics during the assault on the Zilo Heights was the echelonment of tank formations. In the first echelon were heavy IS-2 tanks and self-propelled guns, which suppressed enemy anti-tank artillery with their fire. They were followed by the main forces, brigades of T-34s, supported by motorized infantry. In the third echelon were mobile detachments, ready to exploit success in the breached sectors. The first day of the offensive proved extremely difficult. Despite powerful artillery preparation, the German defenses were not completely suppressed. Katukov's tanks met fierce resistance, advancing literally meter by meter. By the end of the day, the advance was only a few kilometers. In the evening, Katukov gathered his corps commanders for a meeting. "We will break through the defenses with frontal attacks at too high a cost," he said. "We are changing tactics. The main blow will be shifted to the flanks. We will look for weak spots in the enemy's defenses." On the second day of the offensive, Katukov's tank corps concentrated their efforts on narrow sectors, creating an overwhelming concentration of forces. When breaches appeared in the enemy's defenses, mobile detachments were immediately introduced there, expanding the breakthrough and getting behind the German units defending the heights. By the end of the third day of fighting, the enemy's defenses on the Zilo Heights were finally broken. Katukov's tanks surged forward towards the suburbs of Berlin. Here, Mikhail Yefimovich applied tactics perfected during the battles for Poland. Rapid advancement along parallel routes, outflanking enemy strongholds. On April 21st, the advance units of the 1st Guards Tank Army reached the outskirts of Berlin. Heavy street fighting began. Katukov understood that in urban conditions, tanks were vulnerable, especially to Faustpatronen, disposable anti-tank grenade launchers with which even civilians were armed. To minimize losses, Katukov developed a special tactic for urban operations. Tanks advanced in small groups of 3 to 5 vehicles, supported by infantry, who covered them from Faustpatronen operators. Artillery suppressed identified firing points, and sappers cleared barricades and debris. Special attention was paid to cooperation with aviation. Il-2 attack aircraft carried out pinpoint strikes on fortified buildings and enemy concentrations, clearing the way for the tanks. Air traffic controllers with radios were stationed with each tank corps to coordinate actions. By the end of the war, Katukov's military doctrine had crystallized into a coherent system of views on the employment of tank forces. It was a synthesis of personal combat experience, deep analysis of battles, and an intuitive understanding of the nature of modern warfare. Katukov's doctrine became a genuine breakthrough in military art, altering perceptions of the role and capabilities of armored forces. The central element of Katukov's doctrine was the understanding of the tank not as a separate combat unit, but as part of a complex combat system. Mikhail Katukov rejected the primitive notion of tank forces as a battering ram, capable only of frontal assaults. He saw them as a flexible instrument, equally effective in both defense and offense. Katukov formulated three key principles for the employment of tank forces. The first was the principle of massing forces and means on decisive axes. He considered it unacceptable to disperse tanks along the front. Instead, Katukov concentrated his forces on narrow sectors, creating overwhelming superiority. This allowed for breakthroughs of enemy defenses with minimal own losses. The second principle was maneuver as the foundation of tank combat. In Katukov's understanding, the advantage of a tank lay primarily in its mobility. Strike, retreat, regroup, and a new strike. Such was the typical operational pattern of Katukov's tank crews. The enemy could never predict from where the next blow would come. The third principle was the cooperation of different branches of service. Katukov understood that a tank was vulnerable without support. Therefore, he created a system in which tanks, infantry, artillery, and aviation acted as a single organism. Infantry cleared terrain of anti-tank weapons, artillery suppressed firing points, and aviation provided reconnaissance and struck enemy reserves. A crucial element of Katukov's doctrine was a special attitude towards terrain. Mikhail Katukov demanded a thorough study of the relief before each operation. He taught commanders to use terrain folds, forests, ravines, and heights for concealed maneuver and sudden strikes. In his understanding, skillful use of terrain could compensate even for numerical superiority of the enemy. Katukov developed a unique system of echeloning tank formations. The first echelon conducted reconnaissance in force and tied down the enemy. The second delivered the main blow to identified weak points. The third exploited success or parried counterattacks. Such a structure ensured flexibility and stability in combat. A special place in Katukov's doctrine was occupied by anti-tank defense. The experience of the Battle of Kursk showed that tank formations could successfully counter enemy tank attacks. Katukov created a system of anti-tank strongpoints, between which mobile tank groups operated. This allowed not only for repelling attacks but also for launching counterattacks against the flanks of the advancing enemy. Revolutionary was Katukov's attitude towards the tempo of the offensive. Unlike many commanders, he did not pursue kilometers. The main thing for him was to maintain the combat effectiveness of his formations. Katukov preferred to temporarily reduce the pace of the offensive, to bring up rear services and replenish supplies, and then continue moving at maximum speed. An important component of Katukov's doctrine was the command and control system. Mikhail Katukov created a flexible command structure in which junior commanders had significant freedom of action within the overall plan. This allowed for a rapid response to changes in the situation without waiting for directives from above. Katukov also developed new approaches to reconnaissance. His army employed special reconnaissance detachments on light tanks and armored vehicles. They penetrated deep into enemy defenses, identifying the location of his reserves and communications. Based on this data, Katukov planned routes of movement and directions of main attacks. Mikhail Katukov attached particular importance to the moral factor. He believed that modern combat is won, not simply by whoever has more tanks, but by whose crews are better prepared, morally and professionally. Therefore, in his army, enormous attention was paid to the training of tank crews, fostering initiative and mutual assistance among them. By the end of the war, Katukov's doctrine was adopted as the basis for the operations of all tank formations of the Red Army. Its effectiveness was proven in battles from Moscow to Berlin. The principles formulated by Mikhail Efimovich formed the basis for the post-war development of Soviet tank forces and had a significant impact on the military art of other countries. The victorious May of '45 was not the end of the road for Mikhail Katukov, but the beginning of a new stage of service to the motherland. Marshal of Armored Forces, twice hero of the Soviet Union, he led the process of transforming tank forces in the nascent Cold War. The 1st Guards Tank Army under his command became the basis of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, the forward line of confrontation with NATO. The post-war years presented new challenges to tank forces. The advent of nuclear weapons changed the perception of the nature of future conflicts. Many military theorists even predicted the decline of the tank era, arguing that in a nuclear battlefield, the massive use of armored vehicles would become impossible. Katukov categorically disagreed with this position. Nuclear weapons do not abolish the tank, but only change the ways of its application, he said at meetings in the General Staff. Mikhail Efimovich substantiated that it was tank formations, thanks to their protection, firepower, and mobility, that were capable of operating in conditions of the use of weapons of mass destruction. In the first post-war years, Katukov directed a large-scale analysis of the combat experience of tank forces. Under his direct leadership, new combat regulations, training manuals, and methods for training crews and commanders were created. Special attention was paid to generalizing the experience of interaction with other branches of service and actions in various conditions, from urban battles to forcing water obstacles. From the 50s, a new technical revolution in tank building began. Tanks T-54 and T-55 entered service, equipped with weapon stabilizers, night vision devices, and more powerful engines. Katukov personally participated in the testing of new machines, insisting on increasing their protection and firepower. Mikhail Efimovich developed a concept for the actions of tank armies in conditions of nuclear weapons use. It envisioned the dispersed deployment of tank formations in initial areas, rapid advance along several parallel routes, and the ability to quickly overcome zones of radioactive contamination. This concept formed the basis of Soviet military doctrine during the Cold War. Katukov paid special attention to the training of command personnel. In the 50s and 60s, under his leadership, a system for training tank commanders was created, which included specialized schools, advanced training courses, and the Academy of Armored Forces. Katukov personally conducted classes with senior command personnel, passing on his rich combat experience to the younger generation of officers. A modern tank commander must think big and act decisively, Katukov told the cadets of the academy. He taught them not only tactical techniques, but also strategic thinking, the ability to see the battlefield as a whole and make unconventional decisions. During the Berlin and Caribbean crises, the 1st Guards Tank Army under Katukov's command was in full combat readiness. Mikhail Efimovich developed detailed action plans in case of a military conflict with NATO, envisioning a swift advance to the English Channel. Fortunately, these plans remained only on paper. In the 60s, Katukov actively participated in the creation of a new generation of combat vehicles, the T-62 and T-64, which for many years became the basis of Soviet tank forces. He insisted on maintaining an optimal balance between firepower, protection, and mobility, which became the hallmark of the Soviet school of tank building. The legacy of Mikhail Katukov extends far beyond his personal military achievements. The school of tank art he created became the foundation for the development of armored forces not only in the Soviet Union, but also in many countries around the world. Katukov's principles are deeply rooted in military doctrines and continue to influence modern tactics, even in the era of digital technologies and high-precision weapons. One of the key elements of Katukov's legacy was the concept of maneuver defense. At the beginning of the war, when Soviet troops were forced to retreat under the pressure of superior enemy forces, it was Katukov who showed that tank formations could effectively operate in defense, not just holding back, but also wearing down the advancing enemy. This concept was adopted and developed in the post-war military doctrines of many countries. The Israeli army, facing the numerical superiority of its Arab neighbors, adapted Katukov's tactics of tank ambushes and counterattacks. During the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israeli tank crews on the Golan Heights employed methods strikingly similar to the actions of Katukov's tank brigades near Moscow and at the Battle of Kursk. American military theorists also carefully studied Katukov's experience. The concept of air-land operation, developed in the 1980s to counter Soviet tank armies in Europe, included many elements of Katukov's tactics: deep, echeloned defense, maneuver with reserves, and concentration of forces in decisive directions. The principles of interaction between different branches of service, which Katukov perfected, became the standard for modern armies. His understanding that a tank is not a self-sufficient weapon, but an element of a complex combat system, is an axiom today. Modern combat groups, including tanks, infantry and combat vehicles, artillery, and engineering units, operate according to the patterns laid down by Katukov. In the field of tank technical development, Katukov's influence was also significant. His requirements for a balance of firepower, protection, and mobility determined the appearance of Soviet and then Russian tanks. The famous Katukov's trio, the T-34, T-54, and T-72, became the embodiment of this balance, and their design solutions were copied by many countries. An especially important element of Katukov's legacy was his concept of using tanks in urban environments. In the battles for Berlin, he developed tactics that minimized the vulnerability of armored vehicles in urban areas. These principles were in demand in post-war conflicts, from Budapest in 1956 to Grozny in the 1990s. Modern Russian military doctrine retains many Katukov's principles. Tank formations are still considered the main strike force of the ground forces, capable of solving a wide range of tasks, from breaking through defenses to developing success in operational depth. The concept of battalion tactical groups, actively used in modern conflicts, has clear parallels with Katukov's tactical groups. In the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, the influence of Katukov's school is still felt. Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, even after becoming NATO members, retained many elements of Soviet tank tactics based on Katukov's principles. This is especially noticeable in approaches to organizing anti-tank defense and the actions of tank units in wooded and swampy terrain. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, which developed under Soviet influence for a long time, also adopted many of Katukov's ideas. The concept of active defense, which is the basis of Chinese military doctrine, has clear parallels with Katukov's tactics of maneuver defense and counterattacks. In the field of training tank commanders, Katukov's legacy also remains relevant. His approach to fostering initiative, independence, and tactical literacy in officers became the basis of the tank crew training system in many countries. Training tasks developed under Katukov's leadership are still used in tank schools in Russia and other states. It is noteworthy that even in the era of high-precision weapons and information technologies, Katukov's principles have not lost their relevance. Unmanned aerial vehicles, satellite reconnaissance, and computerized control systems have changed the nature of combat, but have not canceled the fundamental principles of tank art formulated by Katukov. Modern military conflicts show that the tank remains the most important element of ground forces. In conditions of local wars, where the use of nuclear weapons is unlikely, Armored formations still play a decisive role, and they often operate according to Katukov's patterns, using maneuver, concentration of forces in decisive directions, and close interaction with other branches of service. Thus, Mikhail Katukov's legacy continues to live on in modern military doctrines, tactical techniques, and approaches to training tank commanders. The school of tank art he created has stood the test of time and proven its effectiveness in various conditions and conflicts. The principles formulated by the Soviet tank genius remain relevant even in the 21st century, confirming his status as one of the greatest military thinkers of the 20th century. Mikhail Katukov's lessons remain relevant even in the modern era of high-precision weapons and information technology. His military genius laid the foundation upon which modern concepts of armored force employment continue to be built. So, what can be gleaned from the tank marshal's legacy for today's military conflicts? First and foremost is the principle of flexibility and adaptability. Katukov was never a dogmatist. He constantly analyzed the changing situation and adjusted his tactics. From defensive ambushes near Moscow to rapid breakthroughs in Poland, his approach always corresponded to specific conditions. In today's world, where the nature of threats changes rapidly, this ability to adapt becomes crucial. The second most important lesson is understanding the balance between technology and the human factor. Katukov valued new equipment, but never considered it a panacea. He understood that even the best tank is merely a tool in the hands of its crew. Today, as technology develops at an incredible pace, this principle remains relevant. Drones, artificial intelligence, robotic systems. All of these are merely additions to the Army's main resource, trained and motivated personnel. The third lesson is the importance of interaction between different branches of service. Katukov created a system in which tanks, infantry, artillery, and aviation acted as a single organism. In modern conflicts, this principle has transformed into the concept of joint operations, where the synchronization of actions of various components of the armed forces becomes the key to victory. The fourth lesson is the economy of force and means. Katukov was never a wasteful commander. He conserved personnel and equipment, preferring maneuver to frontal assaults. In the era of high-precision weapons, when the cost of modern combat systems runs into millions and the training of specialists takes years, this principle acquires special significance. The fifth lesson is the art of using terrain. Katukov masterfully utilized the features of the landscape for concealed maneuver and sudden strikes. In modern conditions, despite the development of reconnaissance tools, the ability to read and use terrain remains an important skill. Even in the age of satellites and drones, physical geography continues to influence the course of combat operations. The sixth lesson is the importance of intelligence and information superiority. Katukov never acted blindly. He demanded detailed knowledge of the enemy before each operation. In the information age, this principle has transformed into the concept of information dominance, the ability to collect, analyze, and use information faster than the enemy. The seventh lesson is the psychological factor. Katukov understood that modern combat is not only a clash of technology, but also a struggle of wills. He paid great attention to the morale of his tank crews. In the era of information warfare, the psychological aspect gains even greater importance, extending not only to military personnel, but also to the civilian population. How applicable are Katukov's methods in modern conflicts? The experience of recent decades shows that the fundamental principles of tank warfare formulated by him retain their relevance even in changed conditions. In the Persian Gulf, Iraq, and Syria, tanks continue to play an important role, operating largely according to Katukov's patterns. The concept of maneuver warfare, deep raids into enemy rear, interaction with aviation and artillery, all of this can be seen in modern conflicts. Of course, the emergence of new technologies has introduced adjustments. High-precision weapons, unmanned systems, and space reconnaissance have changed tactical approaches. But the strategic principles laid down by Katukov remain unchanged. The tank still combines firepower, protection, and mobility, qualities that Mikhail Efimovich considered the basis of combat effectiveness. Katukov's legacy lives not only in military doctrines, but also in the system of training tank commanders. His approach to fostering initiative, independence, and tactical literacy among officers became the foundation for training new generations of tank crews in many countries around the world. Thus, the lessons of the tank genius Mikhail Katukov continue to serve as a guide for modern military forces. His ideas, tested in the crucible of the Great Patriotic War, have proven their universality and effectiveness in various conditions. As long as armored vehicles operate on battlefields, the principles of Katukov's School of Tank Warfare will remain relevant, confirming his creator's status as one of the greatest military thinkers of the 20th century.